Hello everyone, this is Randy. Greetings to you all. All right, today we have another video, and this time we are going to explore how do you prepare for the next global disaster. The next big one. There are little mini disasters and local conflicts, obviously, that will arise from time to time. But I'm talking about the next big one. At the level of the 2020 pandemic. We're talking about global events that will inevitably affect you regardless of where you are, where you live. You could be living a cozy life in North America. For example, when the pandemic started, I was living in Toronto, and it affected me just as much as it affected anybody else. So these global events, whatever they may be and however they arise, they will catch you most likely off guard, and they will affect you, and most likely in a negative way, maybe positive or maybe mixed, but most likely in some type of negative fashion. I do want to make a distinction between what I would call acute global events and chronic global events. An acute global event is something like the pandemic, or to some extent the 2022 war in Ukraine when Russia invaded. These are acute events, right? These are events that happen relatively suddenly, with dramatic implications and dramatic ripple effects throughout the entire world. There are chronic issues in the world as well that are sort of like in the low level. They're there burning in the background, but you have a bit more time to prepare. You're aware that they're in existence, but you have a bit more time. So today I'm going to focus on the acute events, right? These events that happen all of a sudden, or seemingly all of a sudden, and catch us off guard. And I'm going to talk about how to prepare for these events to the best of our ability, what some of our strategies may be, and what these events could look like. It's not to say that the underlying causes of these events are necessarily a surprise, because I don't think they are. When the pandemic of 2020 occurred, there were warnings about a possible future pandemic for many years, right? So the underlying cause and the effect was certainly not a surprise, but it caught us off guard because we thought, well, this was a theoretical possibility. Would this actually happen? Well, it did. Some type of nuclear war, hasn't happened yet. Is it a theoretical possibility that could manifest into a real, actual, not possibility anymore, but a real, actual thing that happens? Yeah, I think absolutely it could. We talk about climate change and the effects of climate change on the world. We talk about, we know there's a lot of media talk and talk among academics and within the intellectual circles about the effects of climate change and how that could decimate certain populations, change the scope of the world, creating heat waves, forest fires, more tornadoes, more hurricanes, more everything, create this huge imbalance. What does that mean? How do we mitigate any of that? These large global events, right? So a lot of these acute events that may happen in the future in our lifetimes and that will affect you, we know somewhat about the underlying causes of these events, right? We know, we're aware of them. We're not actively thinking about it, but we're aware of some underlying cause and some underlying aspect that's brewing in the background. Most of the times we choose to ignore the warning signs, and certainly I don't think we are adequately well prepared as individuals and as families and as communities for the next big one. Okay, so let's begin. Let's put these possible acute events into categories. So we obviously have the environmental issues. So we're talking about climate change, right? So we're talking about global warming, climate change, and the devastating effects that this could have. I strongly believe, along with many client scientists and probably large members of the public, that the current wildfires in California and especially around the Los Angeles area are related in many ways to climate change. I don't think I'm the only one who believes in that. Sometimes the data and the science is hard to prove, but I think all the data and the evidence is there. There are more heat waves now across the world. I was in Europe last year and the year before in the summer, and there's massive heat waves in Europe. There are more hurricanes where there shouldn't be hurricanes. The world's going to look very messy with climate change and how different weather patterns are changing, and not for the better, but for the worse. And it's going to significantly disrupt human habitat and human communities. So that's one category, right? Big climate change. Then another category is what I call lightning strikes twice, which is another pandemic. It's very possible that we could get pandemic part 2, some type of disease, viral, bacterial, whatever. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria, some new airborne virus, something crazy that shows up, and again, lightning strikes twice sometimes, where we don't expect there to be another pandemic within 10 years, but that is a possibility. We have geopolitical conflict, inclusive of the possibility of total annihilation by way of nuclear conflict, a nuclear war between nuclear-armed nations. There are many wars happening in the world right now. None that have gone nuclear, but we could be looking at some type of nuclear catastrophe or full-scale war. There are sort of the dark side of technology risks, right? AI and sentient artificial intelligence, some type of weird technological risk where we have AI or some technology that takes over and disrupts humanity in a negative way. What else, right? Those are I think the big ones that I can think of. There's probably other large acute events that could change things. For a long time, terrorism was the number one threat on everyone's list right after 9/11, and everybody was talking about terrorism. Like, not many people are talking about it in the same way. Obviously, it's still a threat, but that was the number one acute global threat, right? Every cafe you went to was dangerous because you could be blown up by a suicide bomber. That was the threat at the time. Sorry, I just hit a bug in my arm. So the idea of threats and risk analysis changes from time to time depending on the economic and social mood of that particular period. The threats of terrorism have somewhat waned, perhaps. It's certainly not as prevalent of a threat in our minds, and there could be other things now that replaces terrorism as the number one threat. I think most people right now are worried significantly about the economy, so about perhaps an economic crash. The economy has been a very big topic for some time now, for at least for the last 2 or 3 years, given high inflation rates, cost of living crisis. So there's that. Sort of like a global economic collapse as a potential threat. In 2007, 2008, with the financial crisis, that could have, if that was not managed properly, that could have resulted in potentially an economic crash of global proportions if it was not managed properly. Suppose the entire financial industry in the United States collapsed at that time, and suppose that certain banks and companies were not rescued. You may remember the phrase too big to fail. If they were not rescued, if that would have caused essentially a domino effect, perhaps one of the biggest collapses in capitalism, similar to the 1929 stock market crash. Maybe that's a huge risk. So it's impossible to list all the big acute global risks that we face, but there are big broad categories, right? Environmental, disease-related, economic, technologically related, and geopolitical and social conflict involving some type of war and the use of weapons. So, these are the big broad categories. Now, that being said, we don't know what is more likely to happen. We don't know the extent of the next big global event. We don't know if it's going to be one or two, or maybe some of them happening simultaneously, which would be really bad if we had, for example, a disease and a war, or like huge global disaster resulting from climate change, and you throw in some kind of weird technological disruption on top of that. So it could be a double whammy, which is what causes the fall of civilizations, right? If you look at how the Bronze Age civilizations collapsed, and how a number of civilizations collapsed throughout history, often it was caused by a multiplicity of issues, not just one, right? Civilizations can withstand perhaps one disaster or one acute global event, but to compound it, you put wars, natural disasters, and pestilence together, and that's the end of time. So that collapses civilizations, because civilizations don't have the resistance and the elasticity to withstand so many stress factors at the same time. And if they were to happen at the same time, I think it would be dramatically dangerous for certain civilizations, including our own. So if anything, let's hope the next global event is a singular event, and that itself would be dramatically disruptive, like the pandemic at that level. We're talking about not just affecting a large segment of the global population, but also lasting for a significant period of time, which is just, overall very, very devastating. Okay, that being said, we've categorized the different types of possible threats. How do you prepare for any of this, right? How do you prepare for any of this? Let me give you a couple examples, just as to tease you a little bit. Some of these examples you may be very familiar with. It's March 2020. You live in a North American city, for example, like New York or Toronto or Los Angeles. You've heard for the last 2 months there's this crazy virus going on in Asia, and it's spreading to other places in the world. And then the first lockdown order occurs, right? Your local government says you can't go to restaurants, non-essential businesses are closed. This happened in Ontario, in the province where I lived at the time. So what do you do, right? What do you do in that situation, right? Just hold that thought for a second, and we'll explore what you maybe could or shouldn't do. Let's give you another example. It's January 2022. You're a Ukrainian man, you're 36 years old, you have a job, a good job, you know, a high-paying job by Ukrainian standards. You have a wife who lives with you, no kids, maybe one pet. You live in Kiev, and you have all of these news items right now in the news cycle that's bombarding you with information about this Russian buildup of forces along the border in Belarus, along the border in the east. What do you do? Right? Your president, Vladimir Zelensky, says don't panic. Right? In January 2022, he says don't panic. Some of your friends are saying, well, it's not going to happen. This is just a bluff. Or if it does, there's nothing we can do about it. Go on with your daily life. The CIA, you're fluent in or somewhat fluent in English because you're an educated person and you're reading some foreign news. The CIA says it's inevitable that their intelligence in Eastern Europe is very good, and the CIA spokesperson says that there's an inevitable invasion that's about to occur. And there's been a sort of a low-level conflict since 2014 in the east, in the Donbass region. So you know that there is some level of conflict that's ongoing, but in Kiev you're not feeling it. What do you do? So this is a situation, right? We can talk about risk factors and we can talk about possibility, but how do you prepare for this? How do you prepare? Now, the right thing to do for this man is to get the fuck out of there. A 36-year-old male. This is what's going to happen to this man. He's going to be forcibly enlisted into the Ukrainian army, whether he likes it or not. He's going to be sent to the front, and he may end up dying. Or alternatively, he's going to be in a situation where he can't leave the country because a law would be then implemented to prevent him from leaving as a man. And he would be stuck, sort of hiding out for the next foreseeable future, right? A shit way to live. So his best move in January 2022, before the start of the war, is to get the fuck out of there, right? So his best move is to take his family, take his savings, change everything into cash or whatever, and within a month move to another city, maybe go to Poland or move to another city in Europe or somewhere else, at least temporarily. Right, that's his best move. But that's incredibly difficult, right? To uproot your family entirely, and to convince your wife to leave her job. Plus, I've been to Ukraine many times before the war. It's very difficult to immigrate out before the war, right? Now, after the war, it's much easier for Ukrainians to leave. But before the war, there were all types of restrictions because Ukraine was, not part of the European Union, and I don't think they were part of the Schengen zone at the time. So you needed like all of these visa applications. So you needed some level of foresight. I remember when I was in Ukraine, I was talking to a friend, and just to go to England, she had to go through this very long visa application process and had to prove she had a certain amount of money in her bank account just to be able to leave the country. Really, really crazy. So going back, and this is not an unrealistic scenario because I have male friends in Ukraine who've been enlisted into the army. These are non-military people who've been forced to enlist, and thank God they're still alive. But I have friends who I still keep in contact with who are in Ukraine who've been forced to fight, right? And I don't know if these people will survive. So if you're again going back to the scenario, what do you do, right? What's the right move? Well, in hindsight, there is a right move. In hindsight is to get out of there as soon as you can. But in the moment, with your own president saying to you, hey, everything's going to be okay, don't panic. And this is another point. When government tells you, don't panic, that's probably the right time to start panicking. And I'm going to repeat that. When government tells you, don't panic, especially your own government, that's usually the time to start panicking. But Zelensky was saying don't panic. So it's really difficult to assess all of this information and to make the right move. And that's the problem we all have, because we're bombarded with information and with all of these factors, but it's very difficult to make the right decision, especially if that right decision involves a significant amount of disruption into our own lives. Going back to this, Ukrainian man who's partially a hypothetical and partially based on the real person. You'd have to quit your job maybe because you may not be able to work remotely. You'd have to get your wife to quit her job. You'd have to take out all your savings and relocate. Cancel your lease on your property. That's a significant disruption in your life, just to leave the country based on a hypothetical, on a risk, but on an unrealized risk. But it turns out that was in fact the best thing for him to do, because otherwise he gets enlisted into the army, he's sent to the front, and he could die. And then he's not allowed to leave. So what choice do you have at that point? If you know what's going to happen in the future, we can't predict the future. But here's the thing, right? That's the big basis of trying to identify the risks, seeing these factors, and figuring it out. So let's talk about the 3 different types of stress responses that an animal or a human being can have to a large global disaster or the premonitions of one, right? One's about to happen. You may not get a lot of warning. It could be a couple weeks, a couple months at most. But the nature of these acute events is that they happen fast and furious, that you get a little bit of warning. You have to act really quickly, right? Like the people in my first example, in the beginning of the pandemic, you had just a couple weeks to get ready for it, and then it happened. In this Ukraine example, you had just a couple weeks to get ready, and then it happened. The war happened. So, what are the basic 3 stress responses? You have fight, flight, and freeze. These are evident in both animals and in human beings. Fight, flight, and freeze. These are the 3 possible stress responses that we could have to any stressful situation, whether it's interpersonal, whether it's environmental, and it also relates to these big global events. And I'll apply these 3 stress responses to the pandemic as an example, and to the war in Ukraine. So when the pandemic happened, the freeze response was those people who stayed home, and they bunkered down, and they gathered supplies, and they just stayed home, right? They hibernated, they stayed home, and they didn't go out, too afraid to go out, and they thought that freezing in one place was the best response. And in fact, freezing was probably what was promoted by the government anyways at the time. Stay home, save lives was the slogan. Some people took that too far. I had a friend, and even in 2023, I asked him to meet up, and he said I was playing it safe, he said. So I think some people took freeze a bit too far, and they just continued to be frozen. but you have freeze as a strategy. Flight is a strategy for those people who left the country. They went to Mexico. I had some friends who lived for a year and a half in Mexico during the pandemic. These are Canadian friends who just left the country. I don't want to deal with the lockdowns. I don't want to deal with it here. I'm just gonna move, right? Physically move. So there are people who have a flight response, which is to just run away. And that's a legitimate response. That's number 2. And the third response is fight. Right? These are people who, essentially, these were the anti-vaccine people. These were the people who were part of the convoy protests in Ottawa, the truckers. These were the people who were actively against vaccine mandates or lockdowns, and they were protesting. These were the fighters, right? That was the fight response. Like, no, I'm not going to agree to this. I'm going to fight my way out of this situation, and you can't tell me what to do. So that's the fight response. Was that overly effective? Not really. In this particular case, sometimes the fight response is actually the right response, but in terms of pandemic, I don't think the fight response was the overall the best response, but that is a viable response. Let's apply the 3 stress responses: fight, flight, and freeze, flight, and fight to the Ukraine war. So again, freeze would be don't leave the country, stay at home, bunker down, get yourself a shelter in the basement, and hope for the best, right? You have bombs flying overhead, missiles, but just hope for the best. Freeze, just stay in one place, gather food and supplies, don't leave your home. Some of these people, I guess, did okay in Ukraine, and some of these people, they stayed in one place and their homes got blown up, or in some regions of Ukraine, their entire cities were taken over. It's interesting. Like, you saw that in some villages and towns and cities, people, like, a lot of people left, but some people stayed, right? They're like, oh, we built this house, my family was here, for whatever reason, I'm just gonna stay. I'm gonna freeze, and we're gonna bunker down. And if Russians come, well, hope for the best, right? So some of these people, they stayed when the Russians took over their villages or towns and cities, and then they were given Russian passports. So now they're Russian citizens, technically. Those are the people who engaged in the freeze strategy. Flight, obviously the people who left, right? A large percentage of Ukrainians left. More women than men, because men were not allowed to leave for political reasons, and because the Ukrainian government needed these bodies to fight the war. But the women and the children, they were allowed to leave. So you had large-scale exodus of women and children from Ukraine. They went all over the place. A large number of them went to Canada. They went all across Europe. Some of them went to Poland at first, and then Romania and some of these neighboring countries. And then they spread across Europe. And some of them went to the United States. Some of them went to Canada. So a lot of the women and children, they left, unfortunately leaving some of their boyfriends and husbands behind, still, who are fighting in the war. So flight, right? Flight, just leave, get the hell out of there. Which I think in the Ukraine war situation was maybe a very sensible solution for a lot of people. And then fight, right? These are the people, like, at the beginning of the war who voluntarily took up arms. And they're like, nope, the Russians are coming, we're going to arm ourselves, we're going to fight them back, right? We're not talking about the later conscripts. These are people who are literally trying to escape the country through illegal means, and through crossing the border at night. We're not talking about the conscripts. We're talking about the people in the beginning who, in response to the Russian invasion, voluntarily became part of the territorial defense forces. They took up arms. They took up arms training. They're like, well, we got to defend our country. We have to kill some Russians. So they took up arms. They were voluntarily going to the front. A lot of them died, unfortunately. But the first group of people, the war has been going on for 2-3 years now. So unfortunately, a lot of this first crop of people are all deceased now. But they took up arms. They voluntarily joined defense groups and the army, and they went to the front, and they defended their cities. And that was the fight response, right? We will fight. We're not leaving. We're not staying at home and bunkering down. We will actively fight whatever is causing this stress. And in this case, it was the Russian invasion. So that's how I would apply the 3 stress responses to the pandemic and to the Ukraine war. So that being said, these stress responses are basic animal and human responses, and they would apply, in essence, to any future acute global event, whether that's extreme climate change, forest fires, heat waves, tornadoes, hurricanes, snowstorms, floods, or large consistent periods of said natural disasters. They would apply to future conflicts, global conflicts involving war. They would apply to that. They would apply to any future pandemics, pestilence, disease. They would apply to perhaps that technological risk I was talking about with some type of AI disruption or machine takeover. And they would apply to any other of the risk categories, be it health, terrorism, or technological or environmental or whatever. So we have these basic responses available, deeply embedded in our psychology, and these are essentially the tools that we have. Right? There's not much else that we can do as human beings in response to large scale events or small scale events. Right? We freeze, we fight, we flee. These are very emotional responses, and they're driven by deeply, by these, by the hardwiring in our mind, in our psychology. This is how we would respond to future risks. So I think the first thing to do, and again, this is in preparation for the next big one. I think there's a couple things that you need to do to prepare. This is how sort of I'm looking at the problem from sort of an abstract perspective and from a philosophical perspective. The first thing to do is figure out your ideal stress response. I'm not a fighter, so fight is usually not my ideal stress response, right? I have friends who are. I have, due to, for example, changes to the economic situation in Canada, there's more crime right now, more social instability. There's a lot of car thefts, home break-ins. Some of my friends are fighters. They've actively bought guns. They got gun licenses. They've actively bought weapons. They have bullets, and they're doing arms training and weapons training and target practice. So if someone were to walk into their home or steal their car, they'll shoot them and they'll kill them. And that's their response. You walk into my home, I will kill you. Don't walk into my home. Don't steal my shit. I will kill you. I will kill you. Don't walk into my home. So that's their response, right? I don't think I'm going to be doing weapons training and buying guns. So I'm not a fight response person. I'm more of a flight response person. My response is perhaps to buy more properties in different areas in the world, so I have sort of escape routes. So when downtown Toronto got really messy with more crime, more drugs, more crazy people, it just felt really unsafe. It was just a terrible. Downtown Toronto became so unsafe. One of my responses was to buy a property in the north of the city, right? To be away from all of this. That's a flight response, right? A fight response would be very different, right? Maybe a fight response is to learn martial arts or maybe carrying a weapon with me. If some crazy person comes up to me, whack him on the head, right? Get the fuck away from me, self-defense. That's a fight response. A flight response is get a property elsewhere and move. A freeze response to, this level of degeneracy downtown would be just to bunker down and don't go out during certain hours, hide inside one's home, and hope for the best. That would be a freeze response, right? So I've identified my stress responses as predominantly being flight. Flight, I think, is my absolutely preferred response is just to move away. So flight is number one for me. And then probably freeze is my number two in the list. I don't think, again, that fight is my go-to response in any future global conflict. I don't see myself signing up for the army or being the type of person that would protest on the street. I think I would either just get out of there or freeze. So that's very important to know your own stress response and to understand what resources you need in that is congruent with your own stress response, right? So for example, any of these future conflicts, if I'm a flight personality, suppose let's take environmental. Suppose there are in Canada where I live predominantly. If we're talking about weather change and climate change, more snowstorms, perhaps. In Toronto, certainly the winter could get very uncomfortable with more snowstorms if weather patterns change in that way. We had forest fires in Canada, so a lot of smoke and pollutants one year, or it's impossible to go outside. The smog was just unbearable. So that's, for example, a weather-related global event that we have to be aware of as Canadians. So how do I prepare for that? Well, the flight response is I should start shopping for properties elsewhere in the world now, right? Or having some escape routes, some ideas of like, hey, if this were to happen I need a place to go. I need a place and I need to start preparing for it proactively. Whether that's another property or another place or a friend's place or somewhere not here that may predictably be better. Or if you have multiple places that are not here, you have multiple escape routes, right? And you can sort of choose your best escape route in that situation. If freeze were my second preference in terms of stress response, then I should probably be getting more supplies now, right? So there's some commonalities between pandemics and forest fires, for example, is that you still will need N95 masks. It's very possible that I actually need to stockpile masks and bottled water, a generator, survival supplies, just start stockpiling basic necessities and basic medical supplies. I think medical supplies are really important, especially if you can't go see the doctor or you're precluded from seeing the doctor for some reason and you need your medication. So having a stockpile of medical supplies, especially the medication that you most frequently use. But I would certainly say, look at the commonalities between some of these big acute global disasters, right? Forest fire, example, the forest fires will cause smoke, and the pandemics with disease, with airborne stuff. I think the way to protect yourself would be a mask. If there is sustained global conflict and a decrease in supplies of one type of supply due to global conflict, that could be a very similar net disruption that is similar to, say, a pandemic that disturbs global supply chains, right? So the net result would be a lack of this particular type of supply, whatever that may be. Toilet paper, I don't know. But I think if you're a freeze person, if you want to bunker down, then you need to look at the commonalities between these large global catastrophes and what are some of the common solutions in terms of supplies. I think at the end of the day, they're mostly the same, right? Being able to generate your own electricity, being able to, warmth, I guess, blankets and things like that. masks, gloves, basic hygienic supplies, basic food and water supplies, being sustainable, because these things sort of transcend the type of disaster, whether it's environmental, whether it's war, whether it's pandemic. If society is shut down or your local government is not providing service, or supply chains are significantly disrupted, you need to be self-reliant for a period of time, or maybe a long period of time. And then a lot of people will be competing for the same resources, and they'll be profiteering. So if there's things that you need now, perhaps it's much better for you to stockpile those things, as long as they don't expire, whatever those things are. So I would recommend that. So for me, in preparing for the next big one, and I don't know what the next big one is, that's the problem, right? I'm preparing in the abstract for something that hasn't happened yet, but inevitably I believe it will happen at some point in my lifetime. So how do you prepare for that? Well, having escape routes, right? Properties or places to escape to, having supplies ready, that's really important. And one other thing I think is really important is cohesion. So we've talked about supplies, we've talked about escape routes, but cohesion, because generally, especially as a middle-aged person, you're not going to be doing this on your own, right? You have a partner, you may have children, you have pets, you have other parents, siblings, you have other people in your life, right? Like a lot of people are single, but I think the majority of people in the world are not single, especially the older population. They have family members. You can't just do things on your own without throwing other people under the bus. So having social cohesion with your own family unit or within your own relationship and building that level of trust is, I think, really, really important. I'll give you an example. In March of 2022, I actually called a family meeting, and I had mom, dad, my girlfriend. We sat down, and I said to everyone, in case the war in Ukraine goes nuclear, we need a contingency plan. I actually did this. It's not a joke. I actually sat everybody down because I had experienced the pandemic, and something that I thought would last a month lasted for 2 years, and it was much more dramatic and detrimental to my health than I would have imagined, and to my mental health. So I sat everybody down and I said, here's what's going to happen if NATO sends troops into Ukraine, right? If we have American boots on the ground or European boots on the ground, if NATO sends troops into Ukraine, or if a no-fly zone is declared above Ukraine. If a no-fly zone is declared, that means NATO missiles will be shooting down Russian planes. If that occurs, then there is a chance that we could go nuclear, that this could escalate very quickly. If we have NATO soldiers being killed by Russians, and then Russians, killing NATO soldiers and vice versa, the war could very easily go nuclear within 3 months. And we need a contingency plan. I said that to the entire family. And my contingency plan at the time was we could move to South America, so we would get the first flight to, say, Panama or Colombia or somewhere to a non-aligned country that's traditionally outside the Cold War tensions. So South America would be a good place. Canada would be a target. Canada's a NATO country, and we've been traditionally allied with the United States. So there's no, why would the Russians not throw a nuke at Toronto, right? Like if the war got nuclear, well, I wouldn't see why they wouldn't target Canadian cities. So South America, we were identifying perhaps countries in South America to escape to. And also Northern Ontario, and that's the other thing. Stay away from large urban centers. Maybe get a place in Northern Ontario and escape there. But I literally said that to my entire family, and I said, If there's a no-fly zone over Ukraine, or if there's NATO boots on the ground, there is 5 to 10% chance the war gets nuclear. We need to prepare now, because failure to prepare is preparing to fail. And I don't know, have experienced enough in life to know that sometimes these risks become more than just risks. They turn out to be real threatening things. Now, luckily, there was no no-fly zone above Ukraine, and NATO never sent troops to the ground. And I think that was a really smart thing, despite Zelensky's requests and his whining to have troops sent in. That would have caused literally World War III. So Biden was absolutely correct in not sending troops and not creating a no-fly zone. I mean, I understand what Zelensky was trying to do, but that was stupid. That was a stupid move to try to have NATO actually put boots on the ground. Because the war could have gone nuclear, and then we would all be dead, right? So it's, or our world would look very different if the world had gone nuclear, with two nuclearly armed nations were at war with each other directly. It could get very dangerous. So it was the right political move, in my assessment. Not to say I don't feel sorry for those Ukrainian people in Ukraine, and again, I have many friends there, but that was the right political move. Let's see. That's what I have to say about that. Being able to predict a little bit, in the chess game, maybe 2 or 3 moves ahead, looking at commonalities and figuring out your own stress response, and having cohesion within your own family, with among your loved ones, to make the same decision. Suppose I go back to that hypothetical scenario of the man living in Ukraine in January 2022, prior to the war. Suppose he was ready to quit his job and leave, but his maybe wife or live-in girlfriend at the time says to him, well, I'm not ready to quit my job, right? What was the conversation? Imagine this conversation playing out. The man says, I need to get out of here. I think the Russians are going to invade. And the girlfriend says, well, I'm a little bit skeptical. I don't think the Russians are necessarily going to invade. In any event, I'm not willing to quit my job. I have a good job here. I've worked very hard for this job. I'm not willing to go with you. Right? If you're going to go, we're going to have to break up. I don't want to break up. So for those reasons, the man stays. The man stays with his wife or with his girlfriend, his partner, just because she didn't want to leave. And then the war begins a month later. Within a couple months, the man is, or a year, the man is conscripted and is sent to the front. The best move for him at the time was to leave, right? So if you don't have family cohesion, if you don't have consensus and cohesion within your own family unit, it's very difficult to make these disaster preparation moves unilaterally. So consensus and trust is really important. Okay, now I was doing a case study of the pandemic again, just looking at the timeline of the pandemic, when certain government regulations came in, what was I doing at certain times and places during the pandemic, and I came to an interesting conclusion that often, maybe not always, but often the cure is actually worse than the disease. The cure is actually worse than the disease, because if you think of the lockdowns and the economic effects, the vaccine injuries and the societal conflicts, all of that was like, in a way, that was maybe even worse than COVID, like itself, the actual disease. Like the combined effects, the combined government intervention, in a way, and this is arguable, but in a way it felt almost worse that if we had just let COVID run its course, perhaps, and this is maybe a controversial position, but perhaps if we could just let it run its course in a different way. And some countries did, right? Some countries had an initial lockdown and then they stopped doing lockdown. Toronto and Ontario in particular had some of the world's longest lockdowns at about 2 years on and off. China probably won the award for having the longest at 3 years. And then Omicron happened, and then just whatever, let everybody out. So I wonder if government intervention itself and governmental response to a particular crisis can be actually worse than just letting the crisis run its course. I wonder what the implications are for future disasters and future global events of that magnitude. Imagine some environmental disaster happening, and the government says, no, now you can't use gas, and now you have to ration your electricity, and now everybody's going through rolling blackouts, and we try to reach particular carbon targets way too late. In the same way that the Canadian government introduced quarantine hotels in 2021, after COVID had already begun its community spread within the country. It was like a year too late to introduce quarantine hotels. That should have been introduced in March 2020 when people were making their way back into the country. So governments have a habit of acting way too late and acting perhaps in a dramatic fashion, but just way too late. So I could totally imagine a world where combined government authorities suddenly state, now we want to reach carbon targets, right? Now we want to reduce CO2 in the air. We finally admitted that climate change is real. So now we have concerted efforts. And this is exactly what happened during the pandemic, right? These governments could have spent money on pandemic preparation, on all of these things, but everybody was unprepared, right? Everybody acted in concert after the disaster unfolded rather than preventatively. Everybody being, these global governments. So as a result, you have these dramatic shifts in policy and dramatic acts of political will, but just the timing is all off, right? The political will should have been preventative, not reactionary. And as a result, you have sort of overshooting sometimes. So I could totally imagine a world where as a result of climate change and dramatic effects of climate change, global governments decide, now we're going to lower CO2 levels, finally, and we're going to essentially ban certain uses or significantly reduce certain uses of fossil fuels, of electricity, of certain types of energy, and now you can no longer do X, Y, Z, right? So you are no longer allowed to drive cars for or drive cars for more than an hour a day, or you can't use certain energy or natural gas or whatever. I don't know what it's going to look like, but you can imagine this hypothetical scenario where we have huge energy caps, right? In the same way that Greece, for example, had capital controls during the austerity period in 2014, when in response to the sovereign debt crisis, they introduced capital control, so you can only take out a certain amount of money from from the ATM, your own money. So local Greek people could only take out a certain amount of their own money in response to the austerity measures. Your own money was stuck in the bank. So you can imagine something like that happening, where governments essentially introduce these sort of austerity controls on energy use. Where now they're trying to get the CO2 levels down. Oh, it's too late now, of course. They should have done it like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years before. But no. Now we have the political will because, now it's so evident and in your face that they'll have huge energy restrictions. And that itself, I wonder if these energy restrictions, in this hypothetical, which is, I think it may actually happen, but, watch this video in 10 years and we'll see what happens. I wonder if these energy restrictions and the government regulations and the policies, in the same way that they're so fast and furious how they came out and not very thought of, not very thought through during the pandemic, in the same way that they'll introduce these energy restrictions, I wonder if that will be worse than the actual problem itself. And the problem is, we have all these natural disasters. We have, heat waves and hurricanes, and our planet's screwed up. But I wonder if then these restrictions, how they're introduced and how quickly they're introduced, whether they would actually have a worse effect on the daily lives of people. So beware of government regulation and governmental response, right, to the large global disasters, because the government response may actually not be the right response. Or it may not be the most right response. Because, can you really trust your local representative? Or if you live in an authoritarian society, can you trust one man or one group of people to make the best decisions for you? Right? And they may not necessarily, oh come on, let's be real. They don't have your best interest at heart, right? They just don't. They don't have your best interest at heart. They're not here to have your best interest at heart. So these government officials in most democracies don't have your best interest at heart, and in authoritarian regimes they just don't, right? There's not even a pretense that they have your best interest at heart. They have their best interest at heart. So do you expect these people at the upper echelons, the people making the big decisions, and the only people who can make large societal decisions on, for example, locking down a society, going to war, restricting energy use, these types of things. Only governments can make these types of large decisions, or adding liquidity into the market through quantitative easing. These types of things, these types of responses, or invading another country in response to a terrorist attack, right? Hint, hint, September 11th, right? These types of large responses can only be enacted by government, and government often acts irrationally in response to acute stress. In a way that's not thought out properly, in a way that is unreasonable at times, and in a certain way almost uneducated. So can you really trust that? And that's when the cure becomes worse than the disease. So as part of your freeze, flight, and fight response, you also have to think about not just the initial problem, but also the reaction of governments and of society to that problem. How is your local government and world governments going to react, and how is society going to react? And that could actually pose a bigger threat to you, the individual, than the actual problem. Right? Think about that. The proposed solution to the problem could actually be a bigger problem to you, the individual, than the problem itself. So that's where you may even want to consider doing some governmental or regulatory arbitrage. What do I mean by regulatory arbitrage? Well, take the example of Binance, for example, where the owner of Binance, which is a crypto exchange, was setting up his crypto company in different jurisdictions that had better regulations, right? So I think he was eventually arrested, but by the United States, or he had to serve jail time for violating some securities laws. But the general idea was that he was going to, for example, the Cayman Islands or Singapore, or these places with better regulations, and setting up his business there. And this is what they were calling regulatory arbitrage, right? He was arbitraging, trying to get essentially the best deal based on a jurisdiction that had the best regulations. So that's a little business example of regulatory arbitrage. But I think you can do regulatory arbitrage in the context of global disaster relief. Not relief, but in response to governments responding to a global disaster or an acute global event, you can do some form of regulatory arbitrage if you, for example, have different citizenships or different places of residence in different countries. So the response of Canada, for example, to the pandemic, if you don't like the governmental response, maybe you should move to a different country where you are a citizen of, or where you have property, where you like their response better, right? Does that make sense? Where you're actually now you're playing the secondary game, where it's like, okay, the initial problem has occurred, but my local government's response to the initial problem is so shit that I actually need to physically move to another place that has better regulatory responses and governmental responses and policies. Again, I'm using the pandemic as the first example, but this could be a response to weather change, or it could be a response to war, it could be a response to anything. You may want to have a second jurisdiction that you can move to that just has a better or more sensible or more reasonable response. To give you again a real example, suppose you didn't like how Canada had quarantine hotels and a certain amount of lockdowns. Maybe having a property in Mexico or somewhere else, maybe that would have been the solution. So it's not just a flight where you're moving yourself away from the problem, but you're also trying to choose a jurisdiction that has better policies in response to the problem. And I think this concept can be applied to almost any scenario. So again, if we're having an energy crunch issue where most governments are saying now we're trying to hit our CO2 levels and we're forcing you to reduce your energy usage, well, maybe having a property or having a place to live or being a citizen of a country that doesn't have those restrictions, that still allows you to use energy and you can still turn your lights on and you can still drive a car in this particular jurisdiction, that would be perhaps very beneficial to you. So think about that. Think about regulatory arbitrage in terms of how governments will respond to crisis and how maybe you as an individual can choose the right jurisdiction. I mean, some of this is a guess, but if you are a citizen of more than one jurisdiction, or if you have property in more than one jurisdiction, especially if these jurisdictions are very different, that could be very beneficial to you. So again, preparing 5 years, 10 years ahead of time for that type of regulatory arbitrage now in preparation for the next disaster could be a very intelligent and a sensible chess move for you. Think about it. Okay, so can we really do anything, right? Like beyond worry, right? You can call me a worry wart if you want, but can we do anything beyond worry? A lot of people's response to these global events is, well, there's nothing we can do, right? It's going to happen. I'm not too sure if that fatalistic response is actually the right response. I think we should take some sensible precautions, and I think the most important thing, and I'm going to conclude the video, is not necessarily preparing for any particular disaster, because we don't know what that is yet. So it would not make a lot of sense to prepare for something that hasn't yet happened when we don't know what it is, but learning how to prepare to prepare. Does that make sense? Learning how to prepare to prepare. It's like me saying learning how to learn, right? Learning how to learn is actually a skill, right? Learning is a skill, but learning how to learn is a skill in and of itself. So preparing how to prepare. So you have the flexibility of having greater tools and greater knowledge to prepare for the next disaster. But you now have the basic foundational tools, knowledge, equipment, resources. That's going to be really important. I leave you with that thought. Preparing how to prepare. As I now conclude this video, I've exceeded the hour mark, and for any standard lecture, I think an hour is good enough. This is Randy I on the beautiful island of Bermuda, signing out. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you survive the next big one. Certainly, I hope that I will. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.